All right, so let's dive into something that I think's on a lot of people's minds these days, and that's surviving a nuclear attack. We've got a stack of sources here, survival guides, government websites, even some firsthand accounts. And we're going to unpack the practical steps you can take before, during, and after an event like this.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, there's a lot of misinformation out there, even though nuclear comfort's been a reality for decades.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Hollywood and pop culture have painted kind of an inaccurate picture, I think. So today we're going to separate fact from fiction and give you the knowledge you need to feel prepared.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right? So before we even talk about what to do during an attack, our sources really emphasize that location analysis is key. It's not just about having a bunker. It's about understanding your risks based on where you live.
That's right. It might surprise you to learn that just living near a high-value target, like a military base, a major port, a government center, that drastically increases your risk.
That makes sense. But what if you can't easily relocate? Like, not everyone can just pick up and move away from a potential target.
Yeah, that's true. And that's why it's important to understand what resources are available to you. Some countries like Switzerland, they've really invested in public shelter systems designed to protect a lot of their population. These shelters are built to withstand blasts and offer long-term protection from fallout. It's worth looking into what your own country's policies are on this and see if there are similar systems.
Wow, I had no idea about those Swiss shelters. It's fascinating. I'm going to have to look into that. But even with public shelters, our sources all agree that having a solid family emergency plan is non-negotiable.
Absolutely. You really have to be able to rely on your own network in a crisis like this, especially when help may be delayed or even limited. And that means having a designated meeting place in case communication goes down. A communication plan that includes backups like analog options in case cell phones get fried. Even practicing drills with the kids in a way that doesn't freak them out too much.
Speaking of kids, one detail that really stood out to me was that they emphasize including pets in the plan. It's easy to overlook in the chaos, but, you know, they're family too.
Right, and they depend on us for their safety. Now let's move on to what actually happens during a nuclear explosion. And I think separating fact from fiction here is pretty eye-opening.
Okay, hit me with the science. What are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, the blast wave is way more powerful than most people think. We're talking winds exceeding 650 miles per hour, capable of just leveling structures for miles. One source cited a study where they simulated a nuclear blast with less than half the power of the Hiroshima bomb, and the pressure wave was still lethal over 2 miles away. It's just a reminder of the destructive force we're dealing with here.
Wow, that's intense. And then there's the blinding flash.
Yes, the initial flash of a nuclear detonation is so dangerous. It can cause permanent blindness even at distances where the blast wave itself isn't lethal. One account I read was from a veteran who witnessed an early atomic test, and he described it as seeing the bones in his hand through his closed eyelids. The intensity of that light is just unimaginable.
It's a chilling image. So we've got the blast wave, the blinding flash. What else should we be aware of?
There's also the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, which is often overlooked but can be just as devastating. It's a burst of electromagnetic energy that can fry electronics and cripple infrastructure over vast distances. Think about it. What devices would you lose in an EMP? How would that affect your ability to function in a world without electricity, communication, or modern conveniences?
It's almost like stepping back in time, right? Suddenly, all of our technology is useless.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to have backup plans and analog options. Now let's talk about fallout, which is often considered the most significant threat in the aftermath.
Right, fallout. It's the radioactive material that rains down after the blast. Pretty serious stuff.
It is, and it's important to understand that there are different types of radiation, with varying levels of penetration and danger. Alpha radiation can be stopped by something as thin as paper, but if ingested or inhaled, it can be very harmful. Beta radiation is more penetrating, requiring a thicker barrier like clothing or aluminum foil for protection. And then there's gamma radiation, which is the most penetrating and dangerous of all. It requires dense materials like concrete or lead to effectively block it.
So even if you're in a remote location, you might not be safe from the effects of fallout. It's not as simple as just running for the hills.
Exactly. Fallout patterns are unpredictable and can be influenced by wind patterns, carrying those radioactive particles for thousands of miles. One source described a scenario where fallout from a detonation in the Midwest U.S. reached Europe within a few days. It's a reminder that we are all interconnected in this world.
That's a sobering thought. So we've got the blast wave, the flash, the EMP, and the fallout, all pretty terrifying stuff. What happens next?
Now we shift gears to immediate actions in those critical first 48 hours. This is where knowing what to do right away can be the difference between life and death. The moment you have any indication of an impending attack, your top priority is seeking shelter. Immediately.
So what are the best options for shelter? Everyone always talks about bunkers, but are those realistic for most people?
Underground is ideal, and basements are surprisingly effective. They provide a layer of protection from both the blast wave and radiation. But even if you don't have a basement, any sturdy building will offer some degree of protection compared to being out in the open.
What if you're caught out in the open when an attack happens? Are subways or tunnels viable options?
Absolutely. Think of it this way. You want to put as much solid material between you and the initial blast and fallout as possible. So subways, tunnels, they can work.
Okay, so we found shelter. We're hunkering down, trying to ride out the initial blast and fallout. What's next?
Then decontamination becomes crucial. And you might be surprised to hear this, but it's actually simpler than you think.
Really? I always imagine it like hazmat suits and all these complicated procedures.
Yeah, that's the Hollywood version. In reality, simply removing your outer layer of clothing can eliminate up to 90% of radioactive material. And a thorough wash with soap and water is key to getting rid of any lingering particles. One source even mentioned that hand sanitizer, while good for killing germs, it's completely ineffective against radioactive contamination.
Interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that. What about pets? How do you decontaminate them?
That's a good question. The sources we have actually detail specific methods for decontaminating pets, too, using things like gentle brushes and mild soap. It's important to remember they're just as susceptible to fallout as we are.
Of course. It makes you realize how vulnerable we all are in that situation.
It does, and that brings up another crucial point. The psychological and emotional impact of an attack like this. Our sources emphasize that mental preparedness is just as important as the physical stuff. We're not just talking about surviving the initial blast. We're talking about how do you navigate a world that has been fundamentally changed.
It's true. I can only imagine the stress, the fear, the grief.
Exactly. The sources talk about developing coping mechanisms, stress management techniques, even ways to process grief and loss. In a post-attack world, maintaining your mental and emotional well-being is essential to making good decisions and preserving hope.
It's interesting. One source I read brought up the potential for increased tribalism and conflict after an attack, where resources are scarce and people get desperate. That kind of social breakdown is terrifying. Do any of the sources talk about how to deal with that?
They do. Many of them stress the importance of community and cooperation. Think about it. Isolated individuals or families are way more vulnerable than a well-organized group that can share resources, knowledge, and skills.
That makes sense. There's strength in numbers. And in a situation like this, a strong community could be the difference between surviving and not.
Right. They can work together to secure shelter, find food, provide medical care, and start rebuilding.
So we've talked about shelter decontamination, the psychological aspects, and the importance of community. What about practical survival skills? What kind of things should people know how to do in a post-nuclear world?
Our sources highlight a range of essential skills. First aid is paramount, of course. Knowing how to treat burns wounds, even basic CPR. Could be life-saving when medical help is scarce or non-existent.
Makes sense. What else?
Water purification is a big one. Clean water will be essential. So knowing how to filter, boil, or chemically treat water is key. And then there are skills like fire starting, shelter building, even foraging for edible plants.
Foraging? Isn't there a risk of eating contaminated food?
There is. And that's why the sources provide guidance on identifying safe and unsafe plants, as well as methods for testing soil and water for radiation. It's all about minimizing risk and maximizing your chances.
You know, it's interesting. A lot of these skills like gardening or basic repairs are things people did all the time in the past. It's like we've become so reliant on modern conveniences that we've lost touch with these basic aspects of self-sufficiency.
You're right. And in a post-attack world, those skills would become invaluable.
Almost like rediscovering the importance of being resourceful and resilient.
Exactly. Now let's go back to something we touched on earlier, information. In a nuclear event, access to accurate information will be critical. But how do you stay informed when communication systems are down?
Good point. We talked about avoiding rumors and misinformation, but where do you even get reliable info in that situation?
The sources recommend having multiple backup methods. A battery-powered or hand-crank radio is a must-have for receiving emergency broadcasts. Some sources even recommend looking into shortwave or amateur radio, like ham radio.
I've always been fascinated by ham radio, like this underground network of communication enthusiasts.
It is, and it could be a lifeline in a post-attack world. They even talk about low-tech options like signal mirrors flags, even learning semaphore or Morse code.
Wow, those are some seriously old-school communication methods.
Sometimes the simplest methods are the most reliable, especially when technology fails.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Shelter, decontamination, community, mental preparedness, practical skills information. Is there anything else we need to consider for navigating a post-attack world?
Yes. There's one more crucial element that's often overlooked: long-term sustainability. It's not just about surviving those first few weeks or months. It's about rebuilding and adapting to a world that could be drastically different.
That's a big picture idea. What do the sources say about rebuilding in a post-nuclear environment?
They highlight the importance of sustainable agriculture, things like seed-saving permaculture, even learning basic engineering and construction to rebuild infrastructure.
It sounds like creating a new society from the ground up.
In a way, yes. It would require ingenuity, collaboration, and a deep understanding of the natural world. The sources paint a picture of resilience and resourcefulness. It's not about returning to the world we knew, but about creating something new and adaptable.
It's a sobering thought, but also kind of inspiring. It speaks to the human spirit's ability to overcome even the toughest challenges.
I agree. It's a reminder that even facing potential catastrophe, there's still hope for the future. And that brings us to perhaps the most challenging aspect of all of this: the ethical and moral dilemmas that arise in a post-nuclear world.
That's a heavy topic. What kind of dilemmas are we talking about?
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about, survival techniques. Yeah. But when the world as we know it is just fundamentally changed, the rules change too. Our sources really grapple with some tough questions here. What happens to our sense of morality? How do we decide about resource allocation when things are so scarce? Where's the line between self-preservation and helping others?
Yeah, these are questions I really wrestled with as I was reading through this. One source put it as a potential shift in societal norms. Cooperation becomes essential, but competition for those resources could lead to distrust and violence.
Exactly. It's complex. Our ideas about right and wrong could be challenged by the need to survive. Imagine you have a limited supply of food or medicine. Do you share it, knowing it might put your own family at risk?
It's tough. It makes all those post-apocalyptic stories feel a lot more real. Those characters always face these impossible choices. And it's easy to judge from where we sit now. But if we were actually in that situation, who knows how we'd react?
Right. And that's the thing. We can't know for sure how we'll behave in those circumstances.
Yeah.
But at least by thinking about these ethical dilemmas now, we can start to develop a framework for making those tough decisions, a set of principles that are in line with our values.
I guess it's like any other kind of prep, not just prepping our supplies and our homes, but prepping our minds and our hearts for what could be coming.
Exactly. And another important piece of this is rebuilding. If we do manage to survive, what kind of world are we trying to build? What lessons can we take from all of this to make a better future?
I gotta say, it's kind of overwhelming to think about. But there's a little bit of hope there, too. The idea that even from something as bad as this, something new and maybe even better could come out of it.
That's the resilience of humanity. The sources we have, they talk about how important it is to preserve knowledge, foster cooperation, and rebuild sustainably. It's not just about making it through. It's about carrying the best parts of humanity forward.
This has been quite the deep dive. Insightful, thought-provoking, and honestly at times a little intense. But I feel like it's been empowering too. By really facing these hard topics, we've got a better grasp of what surviving something like this could look like.
Yeah, we've talked about the practical stuff, the mental and emotional challenges, the ethical stuff. But the main takeaway here, I think, is the power of knowledge and being prepared. By being informed, for thinking critically and having these tough conversations, we make ourselves better able to handle whatever comes our way.
Well said. I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We covered a lot, but it's clear this is really just the start. We encourage you to keep digging into this, look at those sources we linked in the show notes, and talk about this with the people you care about.
Remember, knowledge is power. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay connected.